And I'm mindful that I might not be standing before you today as President of the United States had it not been for Gandhi and the message he shared and inspired with America and the world.
Two men from opposite sides of the world grew up in tumultuous times to become powerful and influential political leaders in the 20th century. They changed the arc of history to bend toward truth, justice, nonviolence, and equal rights. Their philosophies and principles have been adopted in other countries faced with similar struggles of oppression. Two leaders in different continents and in different eras, two warriors of peace who fought for equal rights, opportunities, and freedom for the oppressed people, and have changed the lives of billions of people all over the world. This is their story of striving for peace, justice, and equality through conflict and strife, and not compromising on their principles of nonviolence. In the decades of conflict over Indian independence from Great Britain, Mahatma Gandhi refused to compromise his nonviolent protest as he pushed for civil rights and representation. His philosophy was mirrored during the fight for African American civil rights, most famously by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha, loosely translated as truth principles, formed the foundation of his nonviolence philosophy and movement. A lawyer by training, Gandhi developed each of these truths during his formative years in South Africa while fighting for equal rights for Indians living under British rule. He tested and refined these principles when he arrived back in India in 1915 to confront the powerful and seemingly invincible British rulers of the Indian subcontinent. Half a century later, Dr. King adopted and adapted Gandhi's principles of satyagraha and nonviolence to lead African Americans to the same rights, opportunities, and freedoms enjoyed by other citizens of the United States. During his trip to India in February of 1959, Dr. King declared, "To other countries I may go as a tourist, but to India I come as a pilgrim." Deeply inspired by Gandhi's message and principles, Dr. King came away strengthened in his convictions to use nonviolent means to fight injustice and inequality. In an interview, Dr. King mentioned his greatest inspirations and influences in his life.
The person who has influenced my life in terms of action more than anybody is Mahatma Gandhi.
In 1894 in South Africa, a train conductor forcibly removed Gandhi from a train when he refused to vacate the first-class cabin for which he had a valid ticket. Profoundly affected by this incident, Gandhi spent the next 21 years fighting unjust and oppressive British rules and laws in South Africa. On his return to India to fight for her independence from Great Britain, he took up the struggle of ordinary Indian citizens, who at the time were struggling with the high taxes imposed on ordinary table salt. Gandhi defied the British Salt Act that prohibited Indians from collecting and processing their own salt. He called on ordinary citizens to march with him to the salt flats in the coastal town of Dandi by the Arabian Sea and make their own salt. On the famous Dandi Salt March, thousands of people joined Gandhi in his peaceful protest against the high salt tax and other unjust British rules. In response, the police beat and arrested the nonviolent protesters. The Salt March marked Gandhi's declaration of the start of the Satyagraha movement, to peacefully resist and nonviolently protest unjust British rules and policies. Despite the beatings, killings, and arrests, Gandhi refused to compromise on his principles of nonviolence and urged his followers to do the same. Over 50 years later, in 1955, in Montgomery, Alabama, Rosa Parks was arrested for her defiance when she refused to give up her bus seat in the colored section to a white passenger. The morning after her arrest, Dr. King formulated the Birmingham Campaign to bring attention and awareness to the integration efforts of African Americans in Birmingham, Alabama. He outlined boycott ideas and strategies against Jim Crow laws. After the successful Birmingham bus boycott campaign, Dr. King mobilized African Americans to engage in direct action and nonviolent resistance to push for desegregation and equal access to schools, lunchrooms, parks, beaches, theaters, libraries, museums, transportation, and last but not least, voting rights. From sit-ins at lunch counters in Greensboro, North Carolina, to freedom rides on public buses across the southern states, to the march from Selma to Montgomery, The peaceful protesters were often beaten and arrested, but they were still determined to nonviolently protest the oppressive segregationist policies of Jim Crow laws. Like Gandhi, Dr. King believed that lasting victory could come from opposing violence and injustice, not with more violence, but by changing the oppressors' minds and hearts. As Dr. King famously proclaimed in 1963, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that." Gandhi's dream of freedom for his fellow citizens took 32 years to realize. During that time, Gandhi's convictions were severely tested when Indian citizens sporadically rioted to protest against the British rule. As Gandhi said, "If we obtain our freedom for murder and bloodshed, I want no part." His refusal to compromise on his nonviolence principles was further demonstrated when he went on hunger strikes until the rioting and violence stopped. Gandhi refused to compromise because he knew that inflicting pain in a fight against oppression was a contradiction to the essence and spirit of Satyagraha. Both Dr. King and Gandhi believed that when fighting against unjust rules and laws, just rules must be used to resolve the conflict. Dr. King outlined this approach in a letter he wrote in 1963 from the Birmingham jail. He said, "In any nonviolent campaign, there are 4 basic steps: collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action." It is during the self-purification stage that Dr. King engaged the followers in intensive studies of nonviolence principles and repeatedly asked them, "Are you able to accept blows without retaliating?" The strategy of direct action combined with nonviolent resistance yielded favorable outcomes for the civil rights movement, as segregation barriers to schools, buses, public places, employment, housing, and voting rights gradually fell away. Gandhi changed the course of India's destiny. Some of his peers in the fight for India's independence, like the militant activist Subhash Chandra Bose, doubted Gandhi's nonviolence philosophy and tactics. But Gandhi's adherence to his nonviolence principles ultimately won India her freedom on August 15, 1947. His refusal to compromise on the Satyagraha principles taught the world that conflicts do not always need to be resolved through violence. The winners in the fight against global conflict were the tools of truth, justice, nonviolence, and economic self-reliance that were utilized to face the conflicts. Similarly, Dr. King had his own share of doubters like Malcolm X, an African-American civil rights activist who saw Dr. King's approach as a weak and ineffective way to fight for racial equality and justice. Undeterred by opposition, Dr. King continued to use Gandhi's principles of satyagraha and nonviolence to fight for racial equality and justice.
I would say that our movement has been patterned after the Gandhian movement in India a great deal. I have been influenced by Mahatma Gandhi a great deal, and I think this is true of many, many people in the movement in the United States.
Just like Gandhi, King refused to compromise on his principles and beliefs of nonviolence even when faced by grave danger, bodily harm, and mental anguish. As Dr. King proclaimed, "We shall overcome, because the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice." 70 years after Gandhi's death, his practices and ideas are still used by societies seeking to resolve conflict through peaceful and nonviolent means. During the 13 years of Dr. King's prominent leadership of the American Civil Rights Movement, the nation made more extensive strides towards racial equality than the preceding 350 years. Gandhi and Dr. King pioneered movements that influenced the civil rights movements in South Africa and Myanmar, as they sought to dismantle injustice and inequality.
I believe that unarmed truth and unconditional love will have the final word in reality. This is why right, temporarily defeated, is stronger than evil triumphant.